The history of science is often written as a parade of triumphs, a linear march from ignorance to enlightenment led by infallible geniuses. We are taught to revere the giants, to treat their awards and accolades as absolute proof of their vision. But the archives tell a different, far more uncomfortable story. Sometimes the applause of the world drowns out the truth. Sometimes the most celebrated moment in a scientist's life is actually a monument to their greatest error. In December 1938, Enrico Fermi stood on a stage in Stockholm, bathed in the golden light of the Nobel Prize ceremony. He was hailed as the architect of the nuclear age, the man who had expanded the periodic table itself. The citation for his prize explicitly mentioned his demonstrations of the existence of new radioactive elements produced by neutron irradiation. The world believed that Fermi had done the alchemical impossible. He had bombarded uranium, the heaviest known element, and created something even heavier, transuranic elements. It was a discovery that promised to elevate Italian physics to the global stage, a victory that the fascist regime back home was desperate to claim. But there was a ghost in that machine. As Fermi shook hands and accepted the medal, he was accepting an award for a discovery that did not exist. The transuranic elements he was being honored for were a mirage. In reality, inside his laboratory in Rome 4 years earlier, he had done something far more terrifying and profound. He hadn't built the nucleus up, he had smashed it apart. He had achieved nuclear fission, the mechanism that would eventually level cities and power nations, but he had completely missed it. The story begins in 1934. Fermi and his famous team, the Via Panisperna boys, were aggressively firing neutrons at every element they could find. When they reached uranium, the results were baffling. The Geiger counters went wild, registering a complex mix of radioactivity that didn't fit the known patterns. Fermi, looking through the lens of the physics he knew, assumed the most logical conclusion. The uranium nucleus had absorbed a neutron and transformed into a heavier, brand-new element. It was a seductive hypothesis, it was elegant, and it was dead wrong. Driven by the intense pressure to publish and the intoxicating allure of being the first, Fermi rushed his conclusions into print. The scientific community, eager for a breakthrough, largely accepted his interpretation. They saw what they wanted to see, a new frontier of matter. But in their rush to crown a king, they ignored the fundamental chemistry of what was actually in the test tube. They were so focused on the physics of the invisible that they neglected the chemical reality of the visible. Fermi had indeed changed the world, but he didn't know it. He was walking blindfolded through a minefield of his own making, and the Nobel Committee was about to pin a medal on his chest for a map he had drawn upside down. The error was etched into history, celebrated in headlines, and solidified by the highest honor in science. But in the shadows of this glittering mistake, a single voice was trying to speak, a voice that history would try to silence.
While the world was busy erecting statues to Fermi's genius, a woman named Ida Noddack was sitting in a laboratory in Germany reading his report with a furrowed brow. Noddack was not an amateur. She was a brilliant chemist who, along with her husband Walter, had already discovered the element rhenium. She understood the periodic table not just as a chart, but as a landscape of chemical behaviors. And when she looked at Fermi's transuranic data, she didn't see a new frontier. She saw a gaping hole in his methodology. Fermi's team had used chemistry to rule out the elements close to uranium on the periodic table, assuming that if the nucleus had changed, it would only have shifted slightly. They did not check for lighter elements further down the table because, according to the physics of the time, shattering an atom was considered impossible. It was like throwing a pebble at a boulder and expecting the boulder to crack in half. But Noddack possessed a clarity that the physicists lacked. She wasn't blinded by their theoretical dogmas. She looked at the chemical residue and saw the truth.
In 1934, she published a paper titled On Element 93 in the journal Angewandte Chemie. In it, she wrote a sentence that should have stopped the physics world in its tracks. It is conceivable that the nucleus breaks up into several large fragments, which would of course be isotopes of known elements, but would not be neighbors of the irradiated element. Read that again. Years before the term fission was even coined, Ida Noddack had explicitly described it. She was telling Fermi in plain German that he hadn't created a heavier monster, he had broken the atom into pieces. She pointed out that he had failed to test for lighter elements like barium or krypton. It was a roadmap to the truth. It was the key to the atomic age, handed to the scientific elite on a silver platter. The response she received was a masterclass in academic arrogance. Fermi didn't just disagree with her, he ignored her. He didn't even bother to perform the chemical tests she suggested, tests that would have revealed fission in an afternoon. But the most brutal dismissal came from Otto Hahn, a revered chemist and future Nobel laureate. When Noddack suggested he check for fission, Hahn reportedly told her that her idea was ridiculous. Another colleague called it inadmissible. Why was she silenced? The reasons are as old as history itself. She was a chemist encroaching on the holy ground of physicists. She was a woman in a field dominated by men who viewed themselves as the high priests of nature. Her reputation had also suffered from a previous controversy regarding the discovery of another element, mesurism, which gave her critics a convenient excuse to dismiss her. But the vitriol went deeper than skepticism. It was the refusal of the establishment to believe that a woman, looking at the same data as the great Enrico Fermi, could see something he had missed. They laughed at her warning. They called it absurd. And in doing so, they delayed the understanding of atomic energy by 4 crucial years, years that were ticking down toward the Second World War.
The tragedy of Cassandra is not just that she sees the future, but that she is cursed to never be believed until the city is already burning. For Ida Noddack, the smoke began to rise in late 1938. The very man who had called her idea ridiculous, Otto Hahn, was performing experiments with Fritz Strassmann in Berlin. They were bombarding uranium, just as Fermi had, but this time they were looking closer. When they analyzed the resulting substances, they found something that shouldn't have been there: barium. Barium is a light element, about half the weight of uranium. There was no way to explain its presence unless the uranium nucleus had indeed split in two. Hahn wrote to his exiled colleague Lise Meitner, desperate for an explanation. Meitner and her nephew Otto Frisch did the calculations and confirmed the impossible. The atom had split. Fission was real. The ridiculous idea was the reality of the universe. The vindication was absolute, but the credit was not. When the news broke, it shattered the foundation of Fermi's Nobel Prize. He was forced into a humiliating position. In his Nobel lecture printed after the ceremony, he had to insert a face-saving footnote. He admitted that it is necessary to re-examine the existence of transuranic elements. It was a quiet, bureaucratic admission of a colossal failure. But nowhere in that footnote, nowhere in the speeches or the telegrams, was there an apology to Ida Noddack. Hahn went on to win the Nobel Prize in Chemistry in 1944 for the discovery of nuclear fission, the very discovery Noddack had predicted he would find if he only looked. Fermi went on to build the first nuclear reactor in Chicago, becoming an American legend. And Ida Noddack, she was pushed to the margins. The scientific community, embarrassed by its collective blindness, preferred to treat her 1934 paper as a lucky guess rather than a brilliant deduction. They argued that she hadn't provided experimental proof, conveniently ignoring that they had refused to perform the experiments she proposed. History is often edited by the victors, and in the mid-20th century, the victors were the men who built the bomb and the reactors. Noddack's name faded from the textbooks. She died in 1978, largely forgotten by the public. But her story is not just a footnote. It is a searing indictment of the ego that can blind even the greatest minds. Ida Noddack stood alone against the giants of her age, armed only with her intellect and a periodic table, and told them they were wrong. She was right, and though they took the medals and the glory, they could never take away the truth. She saw the fire of the atom before any of them dared to open their eyes.